Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for joining us today. As we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Emerging Markets Institute, we're looking back at the last decade, the progress that we've made, as well as the progress that emerging markets have made. And I'm so happy to talk to you as one of the founders of the EMI. So I hope you could tell us a little bit about how we got started a whole 10 years ago.
Maybe I should start by giving you a little bit of my background at Cornell.
Absolutely.
My association with Cornell was really over a 7-year period as far as being on site, which was 5 years in engineering, which was a 5-year program at that time, and 1 year at the Johnson School because I double registered in my 5th year of engineering. And then I stayed 1 additional year because I was trying out for the Olympics in rowing. And my wife was getting her degree in 1960 in philosophy. So I was there a total of 7 years. And so my association with Cornell continued. And for the next 40 or 50 years, it was really in 3 areas of athletics, of engineering, and of the business school. But I seemed to drift more importantly to the business school over that period of time, probably because of my employment at Emerson Electric Company, which had a great number of Cornell graduates. And of course, we were in the business of hiring MBAs, so we hired a good number of MBAs. And so that was my longer term association. Because of that, even though at Cornell in general, I became a trustee and I'm still on the presidential counselors. My real effort was in the Johnson School Advisory Council, which I always thought had very good people on it, and I enjoyed that immensely for, I don't know, probably 20 plus years. You would know that better than I because you probably have the records. But so I worked in that, and my belief at that time was that Cornell Business School was a very good business school, but didn't have as much international content as, for example, I experienced at Emerson. My thinking is that any company that has great products is going to want to sell those products in every market it possibly can. And since only 5% of the people of the world live in the States, that means ultimately you're going to have to be selling in an international, global context. And we certainly did that at Emerson. Joe Thomas became dean. I have a very high regard for Joe Thomas. And he hired 2 people, Andrew Karolyi and Chen. And I thought that was just fantastic. First of all, they're both outstanding people. But secondly, it showed a real commitment. And I think Joe took a risk in doing that. But we got things started. And Andrew Karolyi, I think, was actually the guy that came up with the idea of EMI. And then when Soumitra and Lourdes came on board, it picked up steam from there. So that's my background. And it came through the advisory board, which I finally retired from before they retired me.
So since we're looking back on the last decade, would you be able to speak to the progress that emerging markets have made? Perhaps you could discuss a specific market or specific milestones. Much of our focus, I think, as Lourdes mentioned, has been on what we deem the E20.
The emerging markets, as markets, have made amazing progress, not just in the last 10 years, but for the last maybe 20 or 25 years. And what I mean by that is that they have begun to develop middle classes that are essential to the market becoming a meaningful market. And Karolyi will have to tell us, along with Lourdes, when you stop calling it emerging and you say it's there. And I'm somewhat worried at this point in time. We'll get to that later, but I'm most familiar, of course, with Asia because I lived in Asia, and with China in particular. And in my work with China at that time, the leadership of China, I thought, was almost more capitalistic than we are. And they joined the WTO. And now I have to pause because I know that one great criticism is the stealing of technology. But at Emerson, we always believed that anybody could buy our product and tear it apart and try to copy it. So we tended to focus as much on process patents as on product patents, because the process we could hide, of course, in our plants. So that was not a big problem for us. And I have one great experience just before China joined the WTO. While I was over there, we started about 34 companies in China. And we principally were producing for the local market as opposed to for export, which is a point we'll have to come to later. Of course, we did both. But we were building a compressor plant in Suzhou, China, which was about an hour west of Shanghai. And we were going to make compressors for air conditioning there. And we were going to make 2, 3, and 4 ton compressors, but not the 5 ton, because there wasn't a big enough market for the 5 ton. And then the division that is doing that came to me and said, you know, we have a problem here, because at that time, you could have any company in China could have a sales company, sales arm, a sales department that could sell all its products that it made there. But it couldn't sell products that it imported. Well, we didn't intend to make the 5 ton, but if we had a customer that wanted 100, 2, 3, and 4 ton units and 5 ton units, we couldn't take care. We had to bring another selling organ that had a Chinese ownership. So I met with the head of that particular department in Beijing and explained what I thought was the problem. And he said, well, I agree with you. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And I said, well, I agree with you, but I don't know what to do about it. And he said, well, I do. And I said, what do you do? And he said, I give you a 20% exemption. What that means is that 80% of what your sales force sells has to be made in the plant, but 20% could be imported. Now, in my stupidity, I said, well, I don't think we need 20%. And he looked at me and smiled and said, well, we hope you do eventually. Mm. So they gave us a 20% exemption, and that problem went away. That's my view of China at that time. This is in the last half of the 90s. In the second number 2 guy in China was a man by the name of Zhu Ranji. He was kind of the economic czar. I thought he was a terrific guy, and I had a chance to meet with him on several occasions. Now, I don't think that's the case now. I think Xi is a top guy in China, is less interested in democracy, and in fact, that's a point we could talk about at some time, but I think democracies are kind of losing steam in the world today, because we have leaders of large markets like Xi and like Putin and like Venezuela that are somewhat less interested in democracy. But that's a separate point. So I remember a headline in the newspaper at one time while I was over there where it said China increased its middle market population by a larger number than America's middle market is today in terms of population. Now, of course, that comes to what is the definition of middle class. But we had one division that was sold, well, the division I just mentioned, that they had to try to define for themselves what is middle class. If you say, well, middle class could afford to buy an air conditioner, At that time, the families that were buying air conditioners had income of at least $5,000. Obviously, we define our middle class differently, but at that time, those people came up a large enough number that could represent a market for some of our products. Keeping in mind that we had very few consumer products, we were principally a business to business. Our largest business is, being Emerson, is instruments and valves and motors that we sell that are used on refineries, or tank farms, oil rigs, et cetera, et cetera. So we sell to contractors, like Sinopec in China is a big customer of ours. So I think that middle markets are much more important than they were at that time because they're larger and therefore they can contribute more to the GDP of the particular country where they're located. Now, I don't know in the last 10 years, as I say, I'm somewhat worried, and certainly this year hasn't helped it because I think globalization maybe even is looked at in some askance to what it was. And unfortunately, a lot of the people in the middle class are hurt by the particular problems we have now. So I still can't believe that, well, maybe I'll say it a different way, that if we're right in our skepticism, then it means that they're even more important because the growth of the world economy is going to depend on how the middle markets or these emerging markets recover.
Yeah, I would like to jump immediately off of that. I guess, how do you think this affects, I would say the EMI specifically, maybe Johnson more broadly in terms of research and education and engagement? How can we add to and participate, in the growth of emerging markets during an atmosphere that's very different from what we've seen?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we accept the fact that emerging markets are going to continue to be important for the overall growth of the world economy, which I believe is the case. And we've talked about how companies are going to have to adjust, maybe more interested in having assets that serve the local market as opposed to this supply chain problem. It seems to me that education has to do the same thing. Now, my general feeling on education and my passion has been education in my retirement years, both at Cornell and a skills college that I was on the board of for 20 years. They have to control the costs. So we say that the emerging markets are going to be even more important to global economic growth. We say that, therefore, education of people that are going to operate in those markets is also increasing, but it's too expensive to do it the way we do it now. So that's my general thinking.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, obviously you said you've been retired pretty much or more or less for the last 20 years or so. But do you think you could speak at all to how education at Johnson has changed? I mean, you could go beyond the last decade, but do you have any thoughts about how things are different from when you were here to now, and how you think maybe if there are any specific skills that you think we should be able to provide to today's and tomorrow's MBAs to help them be successful in emerging markets?
Well, I think the Johnson School itself, and I'm saying think because I don't really know anymore, but the importance of it, I don't think is diminished at all. I think it is very expensive. I think we've done a great job of internationalizing our curriculum and our professor ranks and our student body. this year is an incredibly different year. And it's a little hard to know how we're going to emerge from all this. But I think the Johnson School in general is regarded as a more internationally oriented curriculum and student body than it was 20 years or 10 years ago. Continues to move in that direction, which I think is good. I guess from my point of view, I think EMI and Johnson is fantastic, because my basic criticisms, as we talked about 20, 25, 30 years ago, I think has been corrected. And I think EMI has been a major part of that correction. And I would guess the school views it the same way. So I think you're doing right now what I would call a planning conference for the next decade or so. Emerson did a planning conference every year because things change. So I marvel at your willingness to undertake such a strategy session.
Yeah, I think those were my main questions that I wanted to discuss. Thank you so much. Yeah, stay safe, be well, enjoy the sunshine.
Thank you.
Have a great game of golf.
Lourdes.
I will.